Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to podcast number 229 for September 10th, 2015. My guest today is John Dyer. He's the president of his consulting firm JD&A Inc., and he's a contributor for IndustryWeek.com. John started his career at General Electric and later moved to Ingersoll Rand, where he was VP of Operations for their security and safety sector. Now, John had the good fortune to learn directly from W. Edwards Deming as he took the famed 4-day seminar that Dr. Deming did that included things like the red bead experiment. And he was also invited to take the follow-on course with a smaller group. And there's a great picture John shared. If you go to leanblog.org/229, a picture of him with Dr. Deming in 1991 that includes a short handwritten note from Dr. Deming. So John has written some really interesting stuff for Industry Week. That's how we cross paths. Recent columns include The Facade of Management Commitment and Why It's So Destructive, Why Your Improvement Efforts Aren't Driving Better Results, The Facade of Lean and Six Sigma, and Are You Caught in the Cost-Cutting Death Spiral? So if you want links to those articles, again, go to leanblog.org/229. Thanks for listening. John, thanks for being a guest here on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start off, tell the listeners about some of the early days in your career in manufacturing engineering and in management, and how did you get involved in operational excellence?
Okay. Well, my degree is actually in electrical engineering with an emphasis on robotics. Back in the mid-'80s, that's where the field that I wanted to get into. But I ended up joining General Electric and got into their manufacturing management program, which is basically a 2-year program, 4 6-month assignments to learn different management styles and techniques and different functions. But then ended up at Major Appliances in Louisville, Kentucky, Building 5, Top Mount Refrigerators, as a process engineer on the shop floor. I actually started on second shift, and was on second shift for about 6 months, and then moved to first, and then ultimately ended up managing many of the process engineers that were in the building. And throughout that time, the reason that I was asked to go to Major Appliances, they had just implemented a massive automation project, putting in several new production lines that were a mix of automation and manual labor, and they needed somebody to help them get the automated parts of the line up and running. So that's really was my focus. But things didn't go particularly well. In fact, after the project had been implemented, some research was done that showed that with all that investment, we were still experiencing, some pretty major quality issues, and really weren't, making much of a profit. In fact, in those days, I think we were losing some money. Well, corporate ended up sending a corporate audit team in to do a thorough analysis of the plant, and they asked me to join that audit team. And so for 6 months, we did a deep dive into how all the processes in the factory were performing. Now, remember, this is back before Lean and Six Sigma. Process mapping was just starting to be talked about. So this was way in the early days.
Yeah. Back in those days, there were a couple of different biases. One, was this bias towards, we need to automate things. I mean, that was the big push in the Detroit automakers, General Motors. The CEO at the time, Roger Smith, really dreamed of something they called the lights out factory, which would literally have no human employees. And that was sort of their bleak vision of the future, as opposed to
Right.
Toyota that was working with their employees as partners instead of an annoyance or a cost. So that was really common at the time. I mean, I'm projecting a bit based on what was going on in GM.
Right.
You were in GE.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and that's the path that GE wanted to be on. And anyway, after doing this 6-month study, we generated reams and reams of data and so forth. But really, the findings boiled down to 3 things, and one of which is exactly what you just mentioned. Is that first finding was that if you have broken processes and try to automate them, you still have broken processes. You're just basically able to make junk faster, but it's still junk, And then the second finding was that they had done a poor job of getting the employees involved in all the changes. And in fact, the employees greatly resisted a lot of the changes, a lot of the improvements. And in fact, to the point where, many were openly vocal about how they kind of hoped that the line would fail, because they had no ownership or accountability for all the changes. So again, it showed how, by not getting the employees involved, there were great pushbacks. I remember one night on second shift where we had a particular machine that was acting up, and myself and a few of the maintenance guys had been working on this machine, and we were, covered in sweat and dirt and just, for hours trying to keep this machine going. And we finally got it running, and we looked up and noticed that there was no product coming down the assembly line. And we were like, gosh, what's going on here? We've been trying to keep the line running by getting this machine up and running. And so I started walking the conveyors back through the assembly areas, and there was one refrigerator stuck on the conveyor, and there must have been at least a dozen workers who could have very easily freed it up by just giving it a little bit of a push. And nobody offered to do that. Nobody lifted a hand. That showed, so that kind of told me how much apathy there was to all these changes.
Back in the GM culture, managers would have blamed those people. Those people don't care. Those people are lazy. Instead of looking and saying, well, what's wrong with our leadership and the culture and the environment we've created?
No, that's exactly right. They were good people, and but they just felt like their hands were tied, and they really had no interest in seeing the success of this line that they had no ownership for. So no, it was definitely a management responsibility kind of a thing, and that's what we put in our report. And then the third thing that we discovered was that there was no focus whatsoever on continuous improvement. Everything was on firefighting. We did a survey of the engineers in the plant, and it turned out that over 99% of their time was spent firefighting problems, and less than 1% was focused on permanently fixing or doing continuous improvement type activities. So that was a real eye-opener for the executives, and they asked that a team of dedicated resources be formed that would focus 100% of their time on continuous improvement type activities, and they asked me to lead that team. And as far as we knew at the time, there was really no other team quite like it, definitely within major appliances. And it was a struggle. Like I said, this was before a lot of the Lean and Six Sigma kinds of things. So we were having to make things up as we went. I mean, even basic questions like, should we get employees from the shop floor involved on these teams. And we decided that, yes, we definitely needed to get them involved. But back in the mid-'80s, that was a real controversial kind of discussion. And so we had some successes with these initiatives. We also had some pretty major failures. I just give you one quick example. We had one team that was focused on trying to improve the quality of the refrigerator, and we had about 4 shop floor folks on the team. And back in those days, the repair function was the highest paid employee position on the line. And so, after this team had met a few times, there was a real fear that spread throughout the factory that if the team was successful, there would be no need for repair people any longer, and they would lose their job.
That's threatening. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they ended up almost rioting over it. I mean, they basically formed a big crowd, and after one of our meetings, and started, yelling, and it was pretty scary stuff. So again, it just really emphasized the fact that, if there's any fear whatsoever in these improvements, then not only are people not going to support them, they could even resist them and push back in a very heavy-handed way. So again, these were all great learnings, but we had enough successes to where the GE executives at the time said that, there really is something to this whole continuous improvement kind of initiative, and we want to see this developed even more and spread throughout other factories. And so they asked me to go into one of those kind of dream jobs where for 2 years they asked me to go around and collect best practices from other companies that were doing this continuous improvement thing pretty well, or at least getting started off well. So for 2 years, I got to go to every division within GE. I got to spend some time up in Crotonville, New York, where the GE corporate training facility is. I got to go through the original Six Sigma training at Motorola University, well before there were any kind of belts given out for such things.
Well, that's really shocking to people who are Six Sigma or Lean Sigma devotees. You mean you can lean and practice Six Sigma without the belts?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So, back that, there's a whole nother story behind that.
Maybe that's a different podcast.
Yeah, exactly. But I was actually involved in some of the discussions around whether GE should implement the belts or not. And I was actually a no vote in all of that. But I was overridden, to say the least. Anyway, and also during that time, I got to go spend some time with Dr. Ed Deming. That was one of the highlights of my career. I got to go to a couple of different seminars that he gave. One that was 4 days in length, a pretty famous seminar there that was a pretty large group. About 700 participants from what I remember. And it was crazy. He did the entire 4 days on his own pretty much. And at the time, he was right around 90 years old, if you can imagine that. Yeah. But then I also got to go to a seminar that the 4-day class was a prerequisite for, but it was a much smaller group. It was a 2-day event, and I really got a chance during that time to spend some one-on-one time with him, and that was fascinating. I learned a lot.
Yeah. So I mean, what was Deming? What was Dr. Deming like? Getting to talk with him, and we talk a lot about the different lessons he taught. I'm always fascinated. I've been able to do a couple of previous podcasts with some people who worked pretty closely with him. How would you describe Dr. Deming, the man?
Yeah, he clearly was adamant about his philosophies, and he had experienced the successes in Japan with the implementation of a lot of his different management techniques and different focuses on processes and getting employees involved, and all those kinds of things. And I really think that he was kind of surprised when he ran into a bit of a buzzsaw when he came back to the U.S. to try to, help U.S. manufacturing at that time implement some of the same types of philosophies. I remember after going through the first 4-day seminar, I went back and pulled together several of the top executives at GE in major appliances, and we went through Deming's 14 points one by one, and then I did a survey after we discussed each point. Basically, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think this point is? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you think we've implemented that point? And it was not surprising, but I remember only one of the 14 points got a 10 on importance.
Do you remember which that was?
No, not specifically. I may be able to look back through my notes and find, but I remember it's just one.
Yeah.
Most of the 14, over 7 of the 14 were down in the 2 to 3 range, meaning that the executives did not see any value in those points. And some were pretty heated. I remember we got into some really heated discussion about things like management by objectives. They absolutely did not agree with any of that. One of the points about, not focusing on price when selecting suppliers, but looking at total cost, that did not sit well. So now, again, they've come a long way since then, obviously, yeah. And even in my time there at GE, they came a long way in their understanding and implementation of a lot of the points.
Yeah.
But
anyway, I just wanted to ask. I blogged about this recently. I discovered in one of Jack Welch's books. I forget if it was Jack or if it was Straight from the Gut, right offhand, but he talked about Dr. Deming, and he said something like, "Oh, there were some good ideas there, but it was too theoretical." I remember that jumped out at me. He said it was too theoretical, and I think, I'm like, well, I thought Dr. Deming was quite specific. Maybe it's just the recommendations were unwelcome, like you said. Management by objectives, that is still the norm in different organizations. It's a very radical idea, and it's easy to see where it could be rejected, right?
Yeah, and when I was looking back through some of the notes that I took recently from these seminars, it was interesting. One of the quotes was that knowledge without theory is kind of a waste of time. In other words, you can learn facts, but if you don't know what's behind those facts and really understand why that's important, then you could reach, that kind of a conclusion. Like on management by objectives, if you were to say, well, Dr. Deming says we should not measure people, and I don't believe that, then it'd be easy to discount it. But if you really haven't taken the time to dig in and understand what's the theory behind that, why is that so important, then you can be kind of led astray. One of the quotes, and I thought this was fascinating, and I'm paraphrasing it here, but basically Dr. Deming said in one of the classes that a lot of people have recently gone to Japan to try to copy what the Japanese companies have done, like Toyota. and he said that that's all fine and good, but if they really don't take the time to understand the theory behind what they've done, then basically I hope they enjoyed the flight over and back, because that's all they're going to get out of it.
Yeah. Well, I've seen there's a different version, or I think it's a related point. Dr. Deming said something like, people in America, they expect miracles and they want to copy from Japan, but they don't know what to copy.
Right.
And we see a similar thing in healthcare here in the year 2015. Hospitals will go, whether it's to Japan or to visit a health system that's been practicing lean for 12 or 13 years, and the executives will go. And then when I see what they're doing or not doing afterwards, after that visit, I have that similar reaction. Like, okay, they copied a couple of things, but they don't really know what they should be copying. So it's just one quick example is, well, ThedaCare has these huddle boards, and we take pictures of the huddle board, and it's supposed to look an exact similar way. And like, no, it doesn't have to look that particular way. But they go and they'll install 75 or 80 boards throughout the hospital, and then nobody's having huddles. Nobody's really using them, or they're maybe just posting the charts. Why? Oh, because management said we had to. And
right.
We still have problems like that today. And I was even reminded in one of your earlier points about don't automate the waste. We still see in recent years hospital laboratories putting in all kinds of fancy automation, and they're automating the bad layout. And some of the hospitals have learned and have adjusted and realized we need to change the layout, not just automate it. But some of these situations really just sort of linger on, even in healthcare. And we're going to talk. I don't know if you're ready to kind of jumping into. We'd planned on talking about healthcare, or was there more you wanted to say about Dr. Deming and some of those experiences you had back then?
Yeah, well, let me give you just one quick story, and I highlighted this in one of my Industry Week articles a while ago, but still, I think this really summarized for me Dr. Deming's commitment to these things. It was during the 4-day seminar, and right before each break, they had an open mic time where people could go up and ask Dr. Deming basically any question. And this one gentleman walked up to the mic, and he was dressed in a really nice suit and introduced himself as the CEO of a pretty good sized company. And his question to Dr. Deming was, remember this is mid 1980s, actually right around 1990 when this took place. But he asked Dr. Deming, he said, who are you to tell me how to run my company? What makes you think you know all of this stuff? And of course the crowd just went completely silent, and Dr. Deming looked at the gentleman and said, sir, he said, you clearly do not get this. It is clear to me that you'll never get this. I'm wasting your time and you're wasting my time. I think you should leave. And the man turned beet red. I remember this like it happened yesterday. The man turned beet red, said, real in a big huff, said, I've never, and he just stormed out, and the entire place erupted in applause. But that really showed me how much commitment Dr. Deming had to these things. And it, for me, early in my career, it left a huge impression.
Yeah. And it's easy to see why. And I think Dr. Deming, me kind of steering the conversation back to healthcare here. And for the listeners, I'm not putting John on the spot. We had planned to take the conversation in this direction. I talk about when Dr. Deming in different ways when I'm working with hospitals on lean. A lot of times, people will raise their hand kind of sheepishly and say, well, they've heard of Dr. Deming. And they might know a little bit about, plan, do, study, adjust cycles, or they'll call it PDCA, or but the hospitals generally are not managed under a Deming philosophy. But I try to do the red bead experiment, which to your point about theory, when you do the red bead experiment, and you see the impact of the variation that you can have in a stable, consistent system, and why it's sometimes unfair to blame the workers for quote unquote poor performance. People make connections to that in the healthcare, and they look and say, well, if we're all doing things sort of the same way in different hospitals, some of the things that we get in trouble for, infections, patient falls, readmissions, to some extent, those are red beads. There's variation where people get labeled as a bad nurse or as a bad hospital when, all in all, it's kind of part of the same system. So the Deming message, I don't think, is really too widely embraced in healthcare. So let me bring it back to you and ask you to share what you can, what you're willing to, about some of your recent observations in a hospital.
Yeah, I mentioned to Mark that just this past week I had the opportunity to spend 24 hours in a hospital because of basically being with a patient there. So I was in a support role, if you will, as this patient was recovering. And, and I'm sure Mark has experienced this as well. When you've been in the process improvement business for as long as we have, it's both a blessing and a curse. The curse being that you can't help but analyze all the different processes, especially if you're sitting in a chair and the patient is sleeping, and you really have, not much better things to do. So I had the opportunity to analyze some of the processes at this particular hospital. And again, let me couch my sayings that, first, the care was terrific. In fact, they probably saved the life of the patient that I was there visiting. The staff was super nice. Most of them would go out of their way to help. So again, it wasn't a people issue. It wasn't a medical related issue, but it was still amazed me how many of the processes were either broken or still very antiquated. And, to give one quick example, the 24 hours that I was there, the patient had 4 meals brought to them, and 3 of the 4 meals were wrong, had wrong items, not what was ordered. And in fact, one of the meals included a item that was specifically banned by the doctor to eat. Now, what fascinated me about this was that they really went overboard in making sure the patient was who they said they were. They would scan a barcode on the wristband. They would ask the patient the name and birth date before serving the food. So it was like, okay, we really have focused on the part of the process to make sure that the patient is who they say they are. In fact, kind of overboard in a way. You would think, hey, once I scan the barcode on the wristband, that should be good enough, unless we expect that patient to exchange wristbands with other patients. So they'd really gone overboard on that part of the process, and yet served the wrong food. So clearly there were other parts of the process that were still majorly broken. And it just fascinated me, and in a hospital environment, they may not really think too much about, well, do we really need to focus on fixing food services? Because that really doesn't have anything to do with, drawing blood or x-rays or, hospital kinds of things. But if the patient gets served the wrong food, it could be very detrimental to their recovery.
Yeah, well, and the nutrition services people realize that, and they realize there's a big clinical component to what they do. But my grandfather, who was in his early 90s, was in the hospital a good amount last year, and similar thing, wrong wrong food, bringing things that he was allergic to or wasn't allowed to be having, and it's just kind of just repetitive error upon error. And I think what's not happening is people looking at the whole end-to-end process. Like there's sometimes too much faith put into technology. We do this barcode scanning, and we're scanning the medication, the bag that it's in, and the patient. But if upstream the wrong medication got into that bag, you've got a situation where you're scanning the correct barcode to the correct patient, and you're just confirming the error, or you're not preventing the error. So, one of the things stands out to me in reviewing Dr. Deming's work, is the need to think systemically,
right?
And break down silos. And a lot of this technology gets implemented within one silo instead of looking at what we'd call a value stream in Lean, or you could just think of it as the system. That's, I think, where hospitals often fall down.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I've actually written an article on silos, and picture this. So here we are, middle of the night, trying to get some sleep, and at 11:30, one person came in to do some medication. At 2 o'clock, the IV bag ran dry, and the machine started beeping, so they had to replace the IV bag. At 2:30, the other IV bag ran out, and the machine started beeping, so they had to replace that one. And of course, I'm sitting there thinking, while I'm losing sleep here, it's like, gosh, why didn't they just replace both IV bags when the first guy came in to do the medication? I mean, if they knew it was not going to last all night, why not do that? Anyway.
Yeah, well, but there's the firefighting again, right? Just being
exactly.
reactive.
And anyway, then at 3 o'clock, the person came in to draw blood, had to turn the lights on, do all that. At 4 o'clock, the person came in to do the vitals. At 5 o'clock, a person came in to do some more medication. And basically, so it was almost every hour, a different department came in to do something with the patient. And it just kind of went through my mind. I said, I doubt there had been any effort to coordinate any of these different departments so that you sit there and go, hey, let's interrupt the patient just once during the middle of the night and get it all done that one time, and then that way the patient can actually get some sleep.
Well, that would be a great example of, this buzzword people talk about, quote unquote, patient-centered care. And in a way, it's kind of funny. Like, well, what else would it be if not patient-centered? But you're right. It's work-centered. It's department-centered. I've worked with a lot of hospitals where it was kind of taken as a given that, we have to go wake the patient at 4 a.m. to collect blood. Like, well, why do you have to do it at 4 a.m.? Well, we have to get the test results on the chart by 7 a.m. when the doctors do rounding. And so, well, why does it take 3 hours to get the lab results back when the test only actually takes 10 minutes to do? Right? And so then people start realizing, well, we can actually improve the system, we can improve the value stream, and now we could come in and draw the blood at 6 and the patient's maybe already awake. And so some of it is just being willing to step back and challenge the way it's always been. I'm sure for you sitting in that chair, it's all new to you. You're actually observing the work in a way that a lot of people just don't have the luxury of doing because they're so busy and they're fighting fires.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking. It's like it'd be interesting for every hospital to get some administrator type position to spend a night as a patient in their hospital and just experience what a typical night might be like.
Well, and there are a lot of examples where people have had that wake-up call because they've actually been thrust into that role of patient. There's a risk, though. In some hospitals, they have what they call VIP care, and the CEO. Everyone knows it's the CEO, and what they experience might not be any more representative than it was representative for General Motors executives. They never drove a car with a quality problem Well, because
exactly.
they were very much in this kind of artificial VIP system and had hand-selected vehicles, and they weren't experiencing what you or I or somebody would have experienced as a customer. But what is, to your point, though, what I've seen be very powerful is to go with an executive and even just park, just stand in the corner of a nurse's station for like 30 minutes and just observe the chaos.
Right.
And they never had an appreciation for that before.
Yeah, I agree, and it takes those kinds of things to kind of wake up the need to change, right? Change is difficult, and the first step for making improvement, which is change, is to admit that you need to change, and I feel very strongly about that. If there's not a recognition that something's broken, then nothing will ever get fixed. Just one other quick comment on all that, and kind of taking this to a lean perspective. The nurse was super in our situation last week, and it was amazing to me how often the nurse got involved with firefighting problems that had occurred because of other issues. So like in my example of the 3 meals being wrong, in each case the nurse had to get involved and basically track down the proper food in order to give the patient something to eat. It just kind of hit me that the nurse in a hospital has got to be viewed as one of the most important resources. And anytime they're firefighting, that's non-value added time. If they get caught in too many firefights, then the quality of care for the patient drops considerably. So again, somebody might look at this and say, well, okay, we got something wrong with the food services. That's no big deal. It's not that important. But not realizing that the ramifications of that one error multiplies many-fold as other resources have to get involved to correct the situation, which then takes them away from doing the things that they're being paid to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and like in other settings, part of the catch is that oftentimes people doing the firefighting feel a sense of pride in that. They feel like they're going above and beyond. They're being a hero. What they're doing is necessary and important, but it's not quote unquote value added from a patient standpoint, and it's maybe not necessarily the best use of that nurse's time. And so I think that's part of the psychology of why it's hard to give that up. Earlier you told the story about the repair, was it maintenance or repair people who felt like they were going to be out of a job.
Yeah, the repair people, right?
I think sometimes in healthcare when you talk about improving systems and eliminating the firefighting, even if people don't feel like they're going to literally lose their job, they still, I think they have a sense of loss that, well, I'm no longer going to get pats on the back because I jumped through those hoops and put that fire out. So I think that's on leadership to sort of redefine what people get pats on the back for. It's really rare. I mean, this is inherent in it. It's very rare when someone gets a pat on the back for having prevented a problem, because a lot of times management's not aware that they prevented the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. I actually, one of my Industry Week articles is all about that phenomenon, and that's exactly right. We talk about the need for management commitment, and management commitment is a lot deeper than just providing dollars for training or hiring a few resources. It's changing the way they act all the time. I mean, every minute of the day. And that's a great example there is if a leader of the hospital goes to that nurse and says, wow, thank you for putting that fire out, because that really saved our reputation, and man alive, that was a great job. Well, that now reinforces with that nurse that that's what they need to do in order to get recognized. versus, like you said, the hospital executive saying, thank you for putting that fire out. Now, what are we going to do to make sure it never happens again? And that's the resource. Whoever comes up with that idea, that's the one that we'll recognize as Employee of the Month, kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, and maybe Dr. Deming might have chuckled at this if he were still with us today. But when you talk about the Employee of the Month or these different recognitions that are given, I think he used the term lottery. That sometimes that these things are just a lottery. But
right.
There was a hospital where they were, to their credit, they were using these huddle boards. They were soliciting staff ideas. They had them posted. They were working on them. And then I think at some point along the way, the unit manager, I think well-intended, decided to select an idea of the month. And they were giving an idea of the month recognition. And I swear, one of the improvement ideas that had been tacked up on the board, because I like to kind of pick and choose and read and take a sampling of what's up there. Somebody had written down, please stop doing the idea of the month because it upsets people who don't get selected and it damages morale or something like that.
Right. No, that's very true.
I don't know if that idea is going to be listened to, but I think there's something to be said for that.
Well, yeah, and that's why the way we measure our employees is so critically important. And I totally agree that you got to look at the ramifications of everything like that. I'll give you one example on that. There was a service shop that I worked with, and we did the training, the lean training, and the employees were really getting into it. Really liked the training. And the leader of the service shop came up to me afterwards and said, John, this is really great stuff. Really enjoyed it, but we're not going to implement any of these improvement ideas. And I was like, well, why? And he said, well, my number one measurement is employee utilization. And if we improve these processes, all of a sudden my employees may not be fully utilized. And then my main metric is going to suffer, and that's what my pay is based on that.
Yeah.
And in fact, he even said this. He said that I would rather get orders out late if that means that all my employees are fully utilized, because that's that's what I'm measured to the most. So how we measure people, how we measure things have consequences, and that needs to be thoroughly looked at. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, and I think to your story, people, they know they're doing things that aren't the right thing for the overall system. They know they're being sub-optimizing, but I think they feel like, well, hey, what am I supposed to do? I had a hospital director admit once in a meeting, that they knew they were doing things that were suboptimal, but all of their rewards and incentives were based on departmental measures. And
right.
They had a good point. I mean, don't put people in a position where they're going to hurt their own compensation for doing the right thing. Or, I think these are system issues that people often don't speak up about, though. I think, but even if they do speak up, people say, look, this is the way it is. We have to do annual performance reviews. You have to have a budget. You have to measure against targets, blah, blah, blah. These things are so taken for granted. But with that story, though, I think we'll go ahead. We'll have to go ahead and wrap up for today. John, maybe we can do another podcast in the future talking about some of the more current things you're observing, in the worlds of Lean and Six Sigma. As we wrap up, though, and you mentioned your Industry Week columns, how can people find you online if they want to read some of the good stuff you've been writing? All right.
Well, if they want to follow me on Twitter, it's at John Dyer, JohnDyerPI, all one word. You got to add the PI on the end.
That's not for private investigator.
Right.
Magnum PI.
Yeah.
John Dyer PI. Yeah.
You'd be amazed at how many John Dyers there are out there. So you got to include the PI on the end. And then if they're interested in reading my Industry Week articles, they can go to industryweek.com/author lean.com/John-Dyer, and they'll get to my call.
Okay, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for those of you who go to the blog post for this page, the URL that I announced at the top of the episode. So, well, John, it's been great talking to you. For the listeners who don't realize, John and I had a really long kind of initial conversation some while ago. We could talk about this stuff all afternoon, but for now, I think we'll have to call it a podcast. So, John, thank you for taking time to chat today and being my guest.
I appreciate it, Mark.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.